Well, good afternoon, everyone. We have a real treat for you. I am delighted, first of all, to welcome you to today's Science, Technology, and Policy Forum lecture. As I'm sure most of you know, this series started last fall. And the idea was to spark dynamic, campus-wide dialogue on scientific and technological innovations and their potential impact, societal impact as well as policy impact. In fact, with our distinguished visitor today, we were talking about this, that CMU in some way is very unique in the way we intertwine science, technology, engineering with policy, with business, the arts, and humanities. As is the case today, through this forum, CMU has welcomed and recognized thought leaders to campus who expose us, our faculty, our students, and staff alike, to the ways in which research extends beyond our classrooms and beyond our labs. Excuse me. Today, I'm very pleased to introduce Susan Athey as our distinguished speaker. Susan is the Economics of Technology professor at Stanford Graduate School of Business, where she focuses on many things. In fact, she's giving 3 lectures during her visit to our campus, 3 lectures on very diverse topics. Her research focuses on the economics of the internet, marketplace design, auction theory, and the intersection of computer science, machine learning, and economics. She has made many fundamental and groundbreaking contributions to economics, and her research is distinguished both in its application as well as its depth, spanning industrial organization and to the analysis of real-time data to virtual currency. Her advice to business and government around the world has shaped global approaches to internet research, to internet search, I should say, online policy, news media, which she will discuss later on this afternoon. For these and many other contributions, she has received a number of awards and honors, too many to enumerate. She's a member of both the National Academy of Sciences and the National Academy of Art and Sciences. And in 2007, she received the John Bates Clark Medal from the American Economic Association, which honors exceptional American economists under the age of 40 and is regarded as the most prestigious award in economics. I should add that she was the first woman to win this award, I think. Before we hear from Susan, I want to also say that I'm going to invite later on Krishnan to come up at the end and help us with the closing remarks. But I also want to take a moment to thank our Dean Krishnan, as well as Al College of Heinz College, for coordinating Susan's event, hosting her, and also putting her through at least 3 presentations for the rest of her stay here. With that, it is my pleasure to invite Susan Athey to the podium to speak about the impact of the internet on the news media. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to our guest speaker today. Susan.
Hi, thanks everyone for coming, and thank you so much for inviting me here. This is just really an amazing place for someone like me to visit, where I'm often speaking either to computer scientists or to economists or to statisticians separately, and this is a really unique place where so many people come together and share my passion for the intersection of all of these areas. So tonight I want to talk about the internet and the news media. And I got inspired about this work when I was working on internet search. I spent a number of years working very closely with Microsoft on their search engine, on their online advertising platform, and trying to understand really the role of the intermediary in how people get information and how advertisers find their consumers. And it was very interesting to learn, and just almost awe-inspiring to learn how much power intermediaries have in determining the kinds of information that you get. At the same time, you could see over the course, I started in 2007, over the course of the time that I was working there, how the changes in the way that people were getting information was really impacting the news media. And as we know, the news media is one of the fundamental parts of functioning democracies. And so we start to worry as well about whether we're going to always be able to have the same kinds of investigative journalism that we've had in the past. So, you know, the big stylized facts are that the news media is under a lot of pressure. There's a fall in advertising revenue. Classifieds got unbundled. Ad revenue is low. And then we've seen newsrooms getting cut, journalists getting fired, local newspapers going bankrupt, and so on. And the rise of a lot of new forms of ways for people to get information. And I think in this election season, it's sort of particularly salient when it's been widely observed that perhaps the changes in the way the news media works and the changes in the way people get their messages out may have affected the way that the discussion has occurred and the success of candidates. So this is sort of the chart of doom for the news media. This shows newspaper ad revenue normalized in 1980 dollars, and it sort of shows as the internet becomes important, the newspaper ad revenue sort of falling off a cliff. And so, this is just to really highlight that, we should be concerned about the future. In some sense, the news media, the fact that it was so profitable for a period of time is perhaps what we should think about as kind of an accident of history and technology. The newspapers are creating information goods. It's fairly easy to copy information goods. It's actually would be kind of hard to protect your intellectual property, and in the context of news, we actually have constitutional protections, freedom of speech, that make it hard to keep people from copying news. And there was this kind of moment in time where the news was delivered as a newspaper that bundled together lots of things, and you had sort of a little local monopoly over local advertisers and could be quite profitable. And so in some sense, we may look back and say that was a very interesting and unique moment in time where there was a profitable business model for news, and the rest of the time that comes after, where it's much harder for that to be profitable, may be more of the normal state of affairs. So what I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to start with a theory paper that I wrote that tried to sort of think about how the changes in how people consume information affects advertising markets and advertising revenue. And then I'm going to move into empirical work that tries to uncover empirical facts about how changes in how people get their news affect what news people read and what news outlets are advantaged. So to start, let me talk about the theory, and we're really going to focus in on consumer switching. So we want to think about two facts. The internet makes it much easier for consumers to switch between outlets. They've sort of changed your loyalty. So you used to read one newspaper, and now you read many. And so that's not surprising that might change the way that markets work. The second fact is that it's actually hard to keep track of which consumers have seen which ads across different news outlets. So just as a little bit of fact around that, of course, some people have the feeling that what happens online is like perfect, and so other people have the stereotype that it's horrible. So the truth is actually sort of somewhere in the middle. So there are lots of cookies out there that track your behavior and try to keep track of where you've gone and what ads you've seen, but they only work sort of medium well. So this is a little chart showing data from an analysis from a company called ComScore, and ComScore has a panel of a couple 100,000 users that they track for those users everything that they do online. And so what they looked at was 30 large advertising campaigns done by large national advertisers that had attempted to reach every consumer between 3 and 8 times. And they had used state-of-the-art technology to try to achieve that goal. Including use of cookies and so on. But what they found after they did the very best they could to reach users between 3 and 8 times is that actually half of their impressions were either given to users that saw 1 or 2 ads or to users that saw more than 8 ads. And although this may seem kind of arbitrary, the industry believes that those are sort of wasted ad impressions. So this is just to indicate that it's actually pretty hard when consumers are switching from outlet to outlet to sort of keep track of what ads they saw. So if I think about now trying to bring those facts into media economics. So I should say traditional media economics is relatively new. Economists have only really been building models of how advertising markets work for like 15 or 20 years. This is relatively new research. It's a theory, the general theory is a theory of two-sided markets. And so in this kind of, these models are kind of going to formalize the idea, you might have thought of what a newspaper does as it creates news, but a newspaper's business is the business of matching users to advertisers. They create content to try to get people to come and read them, so they have a brand, a user brand awareness around news, but their business is matching users and advertisers. And so the sort of traditional media economics model written by Anderson and Coate has the idea that people are going to single home, that is, go to only one media outlet at the time. So a user might go to either the Boston Globe or the New York Times, but they're generally not going to go to both at the same time. And then the media outlet is like the platform that's connecting the two sides of the market. They're going to sell advertising to the users. And typically the advertisers, if they're a national advertiser, would multi-home. That is, they would advertise on both the Boston Globe and the Washington Post. When they do that, they're going to reach a completely disjoint set of users. And so the newspapers, in some sense, will have, we call it a competitive bottleneck. They're going to have access to a set of users. And so once they attract the users, they're basically able to auction them off to the advertisers and essentially charge monopoly prices. So the theory of how this works is that you compete hard, you hire lots of reporters to get users, but once you have your users, you have a monopoly over those users, and the only way to get them, if you're trying to do the kind of advertising that goes through newspapers, is to go through, the only way to get Boston users is to go through the Boston Globe. And so as a result, antitrust policy around newspapers, as recently as like 20 years ago, was all about those evil newspapers charging monopoly prices to their local advertisers. And there was policy around preventing newspaper mergers which would allow the newspapers to exercise their already extensive market power over the local advertisers. So newspapers were a monopoly problem, and they were too profitable very, very recently. So that's the old world. The new world is going to try to get at the fact that now people are, because of technological changes, able to switch between outlets. So instead of going to one newspaper outlet or another, they're going to go to multiple outlets. But it's also not going to be the case that they're definitely going to go to all outlets. They're going to be sort of stochastically switching across outlets. So it's going to be sort of an environment of partial multi-homing. And that's something that, again, hadn't been, this whole theory is relatively recent, but those types of partially multi-homing assumptions hadn't been very well developed. Now our question is going to be, well, once you move to this and/or world, what's that going to do to what the advertisers do? Because now the advertisers might reach the same users on multiple outlets. So in some sense, there's more than one way to reach a given user. And furthermore, they're going to have to worry about hitting the same users twice across multiple outlets. So the question is, what will advertisers do? I don't want to assume that advertisers go to multiple outlets. It made sense for them to go to multiple outlets if there was a completely disjoint set of users in New York and Washington, but they may not choose to do so anymore. And then what's going to happen to the money? So thinking about this from an advertiser's perspective, you can say, okay, there's a user might come along, they come to outlet 1, and in the morning you can show them a Starbucks ad. Now, they might come back to the same outlet in the afternoon, maybe they read a different page, and so they read a different ad. They might see a different ad, a Zipcar ad. And we can assume that by showing different ads on different pages or using cookie tracking, that within an outlet you can sort of make sure that users don't see the same ad twice. But that user might not come to outlet 1 in the afternoon. They might also go to outlet 2, and if things work well, maybe they'll see a different advertisement on outlet 2. On the other hand, they might get unlucky and see the same ad again, which is inefficient from the perspective of the advertisers. And so from the perspective of the advertiser, if they single home, that is, if they go to only one outlet, they might miss some people. But if they multi-home and go to 2 different outlets, they might hit the same person twice. And that's going to create some inefficiency. So what we try to explore in the paper, we build a theoretical model, is, well, what are the implications of all of this for how advertising prices work, and also for the incentives of news outlets? So how are the changes in the world going to change the kinds of strategies outlets will follow? And so what we basically show is that, well, if you could perfectly track users across outlets, this competition, the fact that you can see the same user in multiple outlets, is going to lower advertising prices. It's going to be a standard kind of competition effect. But if you add in imperfect tracking, the fact that you might hit the same advertiser, the advertiser might hit the same user twice, we're going to get more complex effects. And in particular, we're going to see advertisers choosing not to advertise on all outlets. So you get this interesting equilibrium where high-value advertisers are going to advertise on all outlets. So at a certain price, the high-value advertisers are going to say, I realize when I advertise on all outlets, I'm not getting one user per ad. I'm getting less than one user per ad because I'm going to duplicate some people. So one ad is equal to a fraction of a user. But I like users so much that even getting only a fraction of a user per ad, I'm willing to pay for it. If I'm a lower value advertiser, I say, oh gosh, if I'm only getting a fraction of user per ad, that's too expensive for me. But if I focus on a smaller number of outlets, then I'm going to still get one user per ad. And so then that price is less than my value, and I can afford to advertise. So I can afford to advertise on a small number of outlets when I make sure I don't have any waste. But if I tried to advertise on lots of outlets, there would be so much waste that it wouldn't be worthwhile for me. And so we see this mixed homing, which reduces the demand for advertising, which reduces advertising prices further beyond the competitive effect. And so generally, the more switching people do, the bigger this inefficiency is, and the more advertising demand is reduced. So the high level of comparative static is all this consumer switching, the fact that you've become disloyal is really going to hurt advertising prices in advertising markets. And we can also think about then what's going to happen in the world of media competition. So things like blogs that don't have a lot of advertising, we can think about what those do. Those take up time, but they don't add advertising capacity to the market. And so they might actually be bad if the blog steals your readers, but good for advertising prices because they take up time and without taking up advertising space, so they kind of reduce supply. Aggregators are going to increase switching. So things, and I'm going to show you some facts about that later. So Google News or Huffington Post might distribute you across a lot of different outlets. That increased switching is going to be bad for advertising prices. And then we can think about media strategy, like if you put up a paywall and you reduce your audience. Okay, if you put up the paywall and reduce your audience, then small advertisers, if they have to pick just one outlet, they want to pick a big outlet so they can get a lot of consumers. They don't want to pick a small outlet where they don't get as many consumers. So smaller outlets become disadvantaged in the advertising marketplace. So by putting up a paywall, you first lose a bunch of users, and then you second get lower price per user because you're smaller. The smaller you are, the lower your price per user. On the other hand, something like Facebook, which sees many, many users, maybe not all day, not exclusively, but they see all users once, they have a really advantaged position in the advertising market because they can sell to an advertiser the chance to reach everybody once without any duplication. And in fact, that is what Facebook sells their advertisers. They don't sell network information, or they sell basically reach, the ability to reach. So in all of that context, we then might expect to see a lot of media mergers, consolidation, and a lot of benefits to being big and broad, which will change the kinds of news that we get. All right, so then now let me move on to talk more detail and show some more empirical work about the power of aggregators and intermediaries. And now I'm going to move away from advertising markets effects and focus on what happens to consumers and the kinds of news that they read. So first, I just want to highlight a specific finding. This is the one slide that overlaps with my talk from earlier today. I want to talk about the power of intermediaries to change what you read. So when I worked in a search engine, this is completely obvious. If you work in any online firm, it's obvious. But if you're not in Silicon Valley, you might actually think that you choose what you read. Okay? You might think that you control your own destiny. And it just turns out that your role in choosing what you do is much smaller than you think it is. You are much more influenced by intermediaries. The intermediaries are kind of puppeteers, and you're all the puppets. So how do you kind of document the magnitude of that? Well, when I was doing some work with Microsoft for the European Commission, and the chief economist office said, well, you know, we think that we found some documents. We've got internal documents from Google that shows that Google has manipulated the search results to put Google on top and put other things smaller. So we know that they put Google Finance on top, even though Yahoo was better. We have evidence that says that they did this. But really, what difference could it make? As an economist, I'm used to thinking about search cost as being like driving to another store, not scanning your eyeballs 3 inches down a page, right? From a policy perspective, how big a deal could it be to scan your eyeballs 3 inches? So in response to this question, I ran a randomized controlled experiment at Bing with a couple million users. And just before the users were about to see their search results, we reversed the ranking of the results. So we took what was supposed to go in position 1 and put it in position 3, took what was position 3 and put it in position 1. And then we saw, how does that affect how many clicks the users do? So up here, the control users, for the control treatment, when the thing that's supposed to be on top is in the first position, it's clicked 25% of the time. But when you take that thing in position 1 and move it down to position 3, they lose 13.5% of clicks. That is, their new click-through rate is only 12% instead of 25%. So just moving the result from position 1 to position 3 makes you lose more than half of your clicks. And this also holds up if you look at dwell time or other measures. The difference between the light bar and the dark bar is showing the difference between, is essentially separating correlation from causality. So in the baseline data, the thing that was normally in position 3 was clicked 7% of the time. But when I take the thing from position 1 and put it into position 3, it's clicked 12% of the time. And so that's showing the thing that was in position 1 was better than the thing that was in position 3. That is, Bing aren't idiots. They put better things on top. But if you take the good thing and you move it down the page, it's going to lose more than half of its clicks. And of course, if you move it to the bottom of the page, it loses most of its clicks. So, of course, I'm going to be talking about other things than search today, but I was able to run a randomized experiment here and not on Google News. So but just the point is that the way that news is organized, the way that information is presented, can make a very big difference on what you read and how informed the population is, and therefore whether or not they believe facts that aren't facts. I had an anecdote from a U.S. legislature who said that 10 or 15 years ago, maybe you get these letters from the constituents, and only a small share were about non-facts. Oh, I have this big problem, X is happening, but X isn't happening. And he said today, like some large share of the questions that come in from constituents involve non-facts. So I'm so worried because, the Affordable Care Act is going to make me do X, but the Affordable Care Act is not going to make me do X. Okay. So if you think about the role of the information that we get on the internet and misinformation, we might think these things are important, whether or not people are getting their news ranked by Facebook, ranked by aggregators, and so on. So now I'm going to talk about aggregators. So aggregators, things like Google News and so on, that get in between the user and the newspapers. And then after I talk about aggregators, I'll also touch on social media, things like Facebook and Twitter. So the first study was really, I got started on it, and I've been working on this for an embarrassingly long time. In 2009, I spoke at a workshop at the FTC where a bunch of newspapers had come together to ask the FTC to get sorts of antitrust exemption to help them band together and fight against the evil aggregators. So they were very upset with Google News and other intermediaries that they felt were sort of stealing their content. So Google News presents a page that looks a lot like the New York Times homepage, except Google News doesn't actually hire any reporters. They're going to show snippets from other newspapers. It looks like the New York Times page, and so the New York Times might feel that that's a substitute for them. It's a competitor. But yet they're not actually having to bear any of the costs of producing the journalism. So also on the stage, much more interesting than anything I said, were both Rupert Murdoch and Arianna Huffington. So this made a very amusing conference. So Arianna Huffington had gone through all of Rupert Murdoch's speeches and found some choice quotes. So Arianna Huffington quoting Rupert Murdoch. Rupert Murdoch says that Google News are parasites, content kleptomaniacs, vampires, tech tapeworms on the intestines of the internet, and thieves who steal all our copyright. So let's pause on the tech tapeworms one. That's really fun, isn't it? I actually love that because whatever you think of Rupert Murdoch, he's actually a really good economist. He's a good business person and a good economist. So he's actually using a very nice metaphor for the economics, because what he's saying is that a parasite, well, they don't do any of their own work, so the newspapers go out and do all the work and send the reporters to Syria and risk their lives. Google News doesn't do any of that. But the parasite kind of sucks the life out of their host, so people are going to Google News and not seeing any advertising, rather than going to the New York Times and seeing advertising. Therefore, they're stealing advertising revenue. They're taking away the returns to the investment from the New York Times. So then Rupert Murdoch goes on to say, in now him speaking in his own words, to paraphrase a famous economist, there's no such thing as a free news story. That is, hey, Rupert Murdoch's not in the charity business. He's only sending reporters to Syria because he expects to get a return on his investment. And if they read that news on Google News, he's not getting the return on the investment. Therefore, the person who did the R&D is not rewarded. On the other hand, Arianna Huffington says, you're not in Toto anymore. You're not in Kansas anymore, Toto. The world has changed. And she says, aggregators are like taxis. They drive traffic to newspapers, and they lower the cost of news discovery. So what I'm going to do is try to provide evidence to sort these things out. Is it the case that Google News helps you find stuff? Or is it the case that it steals readers from newspapers? Okay. And of course, both could be going on, and indeed that is what we're going to find. So if we think about how we could possibly tease this out, though, it's a little bit difficult. Because also at the FTC conference, a guy from Google says, oh gosh, newspapers, if you don't like us, you can opt out of Google News. It's okay. Just tell us you don't want us to be there and we'll take you out. Now that's a little bit disingenuous, because if you take out one newspaper, that doesn't affect Google News at all. So it doesn't affect user behavior, but that one newspaper is going to lose traffic, and that traffic is going to go to someone else. So an experiment where one newspaper left Google News wouldn't really tell us much about the overall impact of Google News. So what we need to try to study this empirically is we would like to see a world with Google News and a world without Google News. Or maybe we would like to see a world with Google News with all of its content, and a world with Google News with some big block of content gone. So I'm going to show two natural experiments that occurred where I can approximate those kinds of counterfactuals, and so therefore measure the impact. So the first one is Spain. And so just like at the FTC, newspapers all over the world have been going to their governments and legislatures to complain about how these intermediaries are kind of stealing their stuff and not sharing revenue. So in Spain, the parliament actually listened to the newspapers, and they passed a law saying Google News would have to share revenue with the newspaper publishers. The next day, Google News shut down in Spain. So that provided us with this interesting natural experiment to see what happened when Google News goes away. So we're going to try to measure the effects of this by looking at a sample of internet browsing data. And I'll say all of my empirical work is based on PC browsing data. This is very sad because, especially social media, mostly goes on mobile. I don't have that data. I wish I did. So I do the best I can with what I've got. So I'm going to get a sample of 160,000 PC internet users in Spain who read at least one news website per week during the relevant time period. I'm going to look at 175 Spanish news outlets that together comprise 95% of news browsing. And I'm going to basically try to use my data to understand what the impact of Google News shutting down was. So in the weeks after Google News shut down, it was reported in the newspapers in Spain, because they were all very interested in this, that shutting down Google News had been a disaster for Spanish news outlets. News browsing in Spain was down 10, 15, 20% week over week. But if you look at the dates down here a little bit, you'll notice something. This is Christmas. And so news browsing in the weeks leading up to Christmas was sort of on a steady decline. There was also this crazy spike here where the princess was indicted on corruption charges. So we might worry right away that trying to just look at what happened before and after might be a little bit difficult because of holidays and other special events. It might be difficult to say that, well, what would have happened afterwards if it hadn't been for the Spanish news was that this chart would have just extended without any fluctuations. So I need to do something else. And then when you look into the data a little bit more carefully, you start to get very suspicious about the idea that Google News could have caused a 20% decline in news consumption, because actually, it turns out that Google News is only a very small share of news referrals. So what I've got on this chart are different forms of referral sources. Referral source is what sends you to a newspaper. Direct navigation is when you go directly to NewYorkTimes.com. Search is when you search a topic on Google search and then you click on a link and go to the story. Google News is when you go to news.google.com and you look at the thing that looks like a news outlet's homepage. And that's actually very small in Spain. It's important worldwide, but in Spain it's not super popular. So Google search was really important, but Google News itself was not all that important, and that's the only thing that shut down. So clearly losing, a tiny fraction of people couldn't have caused a major change all across the board. Now, after I did this chart, you might have thought maybe I should just quit my research project because this is sort of too small to study. But what I did instead is I said, well, all right, obviously I can't study the effect of Google News shutting down on people who don't use Google News. But what I can do is study the effect of Google News shutting down on the people who do use Google News. And what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to construct myself a synthetic control group, a set of people that look like my Google News people, except they don't use Google News, and I'm going to use them to construct a counterfactual time trend of what would have happened if Google News had stayed in business. So just to kind of show you the picture on Google News versus Google Search, Google News homepage, and it's a little bit hard to see in a small screenshot, but it's something that has all the different categories of news, and it's going to be organized by topic, and this is going to be affected by the law. When you go to google.com and search for, say, Joe Biden, you're going to get search results. They look similar, but this is kind of just regular Google search, and that's where most of the news referrals come from. People just type into their browser what they're looking for, and they get a Google search result. Okay, so what my empirical strategy, again, is going to be that what I want to do is construct the counterfactual time trend. I want to know counterfactually, if Google News had not shut down, what would my Google News users have done in the successive periods? And so to construct this synthetic control group, what I do is I take people in the period before shutdown that looked just like my Google News users in terms of how much news they read, as well as how much they use the internet. Okay? And I'm going to do, there's many ways you could do this. I'm going to keep things simple, I'm going to do exact matching. I've got 20 buckets of news consumption and 20 buckets of internet usage, and I'm going to match my people exactly with other people in that bucket. And so you can see in the pre-period, my matching, I haven't matched this day by day, I just matched this on aggregate, but I did a pretty good job with my matching because the time trends, weekdays, weekends, etc., match up really nicely in the pre-period. But once we get to the post-period, they diverge. And so what happens is that the Google News users in red, the people, I'm going to call these my treatment users, the people that were affected by the shutdown, reduce their news relative to the counterfactual time trend. So, of course, you can see directly that they reduce their news overall, but what the blue line helps me do is to say, well, gosh, there would have been a spike on this Princess Christina Day, and indeed there is, and it also helps me say that, well, after Christmas, the news reading should have popped back up, but it didn't. Okay? So using this approach, which economists call difference in difference strategy, it's a very simple empirical strategy, I can estimate a 15.6% reduction in news page views and a 17.5% reduction in articles. So the page views include the landing pages, the front pages, as well as the articles themselves, and so I'm going to distinguish among those. So that's my baseline finding, that if you take Google News away from people, they're going to read less news. And so that supports the Google News perspective that Google News is a complement to news outlets. Okay. But then, so that's, again, the question was, is it a substitute or a complement? And let me just pause for a second and say that this type of question about a new business model is something that comes up in a lot of new internet businesses. So is Uber a substitute for taxis? Is Uber a substitute for black cars? Or is it something else? Is Airbnb a substitute for hotels? In some sense, for vacation renters, maybe Airbnb is a complement for smaller vacation rental people who could list through Airbnb. So Airbnb is a complement for some things, and it's a substitute for other things. And so it's pretty common that these new internet businesses are hard. It's hard to put them in a market. It's hard to say, are they competitors or complements for the existing markets? And often they're a little bit of both, depending on who you look at. Airbnb is not really a substitute for a fancy hotel, but it might be a substitute for a low-end hotel, and so on. So then we can, now I'm going to show you, I'm not going to do all these full pictures anymore, but I'm going to show you summary statistics which are called the diff and diff estimates. And so the diff and diff estimates you can think of is it's this blue minus red minus blue minus red. And so generally blue minus red, that difference is going to be very small in the pre-period, and it's going to be bigger in the post-period. And so that difference in difference is my estimate of the causal effect of Google News. Okay. So I can break things out, first of all, in terms of what kinds of content are affected in which way by Google News going away. And in particular, I've been breaking out articles, landing pages excluding Google News, because Google News is itself like a home page, and other content. And so I'm going to see that when you take Google News away, you're going to read less articles, but you're actually going to go read more landing pages. So the home pages of newspapers are going to benefit from Google News going away. But from the New York Times perspective, you would see they're going to come to my home page more, but read my articles less. Okay, so that's a sort of a mixed effect. And of course, the home pages are where they make a lot of their advertising revenue. That's where the most expensive ads are. Getting back to my previous point, advertisers like to get a lot of reach, and so advertising on that home page is a way to get a lot of users and not hit too many of them twice. So then we can say, well, look a little more closely at how people redistributed their reading. If Google News goes away, what do they do next? And so they substitute a lot to direct referrals and to search. So they search is a little bit of a substitute for Google News when you take it away. And then I can also look at how long people spend, and all of our results are kind of robust to looking at how long people spend. One thing you might worry about is when you go to Google News, you click on lots of things, but you don't stay there very long. And that's true to some extent, but it's only a small effect. So roughly the effects on page views are the same as the results on dwell time. But now let's start to get a little bit more interesting. So I've said so far, Google News overall is a complement for the news industry, but actually the effects are going to be quite heterogeneous. So I can first of all break out the news outlets into top 5 outlets, middle 15, and less than 20. And so what's going to turn out is that when Google News goes away, the top 5 outlets are helped. So Google News is a competitor for the top 5. And if you think about that intuitively, if you don't have Google News, what are you going to do? You're going to find another top outlet and go there to get your overall coverage. Now, from that perspective, if you think that also the top 5 outlets are the ones sending reporters to Syria and doing a lot of the in-depth investigative journalism, then you start to feel a little bit less sanguine about this, because you guys say, gosh, Google News really is a substitute for the New York Times, and therefore its existence might be funding less reporters to Syria and less publication. For the middle 6 to 20, it's kind of a wash overall. And for the small outlets, taking Google News away is bad. So Google News helps small outlets. Again, if you think about it, how often do you actually type in the URL for a small outlet? Generally, you're getting sent there by somebody else. And the search costs of kind of trying to go there and look are just too high to make it worth your time. So for small outlets, Google News is a search engine. It helps you find stuff. And even though in general it's not worth your time to go to these small outlets, occasionally they have a really good story or they're the first to break a story. If they do, Google News is going to reward you and send you there. So in the policy space, actually there's a lot of people in the journalism scholarship area that worry a lot about media diversity. And so those people say, this is really exciting, Google News is really good because it helps you find lots of small outlets and helps us provide diversity. So something that would take more work, and I've been working on this for years, so I haven't dug into this yet, that I could possibly try to do is really measure the diversity of the news and figure out whether Google News increases or decreases diversity. And I haven't done that yet. But I am going to show you a few results that are suggestive in that direction. So bottom line is that I can say who's hurt and who's helped, but I don't know what the implications are for welfare. But generally, we would like people to be visiting the sites that do the R&D. And so whichever R&D is non-duplicative and unique and valuable, those are the people where we'd like the consumers to be reading their news because that's going to be what funds that research. But we just don't know where we really want more users to go. Okay. So we also can look at switching, so number of distinct outlets visited, and of course it's kind of pretty intuitive, but when you take Google News away, you get pretty large reductions in the number of distinct outlets visited across all outlets, but especially for small outlets. So your Google News and things like Google News make you much less loyal as a reader. That can have implications for advertising revenue as well, because if the newspaper doesn't know the reader, they can't serve them as relevant ads, and they also won't make as much money on them. So now let's go a little bit deeper into like what is actually special about Google News and other online intermediaries. So one thing is that it allows you to read more deeply on preferred topics and do more research as a user. Second, and this is something newspapers get upset about, it's sort of got this unfair advantage from a newspaper's perspective, but a very convenient advantage from a user's perspective of having the latest news. If any news outlet has broken a story, Google News can have it 5 seconds later. And if it's an interesting story, and if people start searching for it on google.com, they can put it at the top of their page, and they will, is that right? Okay. Then they will be able to get that story first. So let me just show, I'm going to skip to looking at the ability, so I'm going to try to break out what kinds of news are very hard for users to find substitutes for when Google News goes away. So we break out news according to how recent the news is in the first hour since publication up to 11 plus. And we also break out news into news that is scarce and non-scarce for a particular user. So if you usually read the New York Times, I look at my control users and I see, does New York Times cover this topic more or less than the news industry as a whole? And so for every user, I find their most popular outlets, and then I determine for that user whether a topic is undercovered on their preferred outlets or not. And then what I do is I try to estimate whether the Google News users are going to be able to find a good substitute for their news reading according to how scarce it is, as well as according to how recent it is. So what I do is I make a prediction, and the prediction are the long bars, about how much the Google News users' news reading should be reduced if I just zeroed out the Google News from their browsing and didn't replace it with anything. So this is like the counterfactual if Google News goes away and they don't substitute. So for example, my prediction here is that for very recent, very scarce news, you would see about, if you just zeroed out Google News, they would see like a 77% reduction in reading that kind of news if you took Google News away. Then the dark bar is the actual, And so in this case, the counterfactual equals the actual. That is, if you took Google News away, you would lose 77%. And in fact, they do lose 77%. They cannot find a good substitute for that. So they just lose very recent news that is not well covered on their preferred news outlets. On the other hand, way up here, for non-scarce news that has been broken for more than half a day, I would predict if you just zeroed out Google News, you would get more than a 20% reduction in that news reading, but actually they only get like a 7% reduction, which is basically saying that they were able to find good substitutes for stuff that's well covered on their own outlets and that's not very recent. So essentially what Google, when I try to account for what kind of news is going away, your Google News users are losing their access to news that was covered on a wider range of outlets than they usually read, and to news that was recently breaking. And so I think when I think about the strategy of the news industry, therefore, this is kind of what you're competing with. If you're trying to keep from losing your users, what your users are getting elsewhere that they're not getting on the New York Times is this kind of recent news and also in-depth coverage. Which leads me to the same conclusion I had for my advertising thing, which is I would expect to see more mergers, more joint ventures, more sharing of content as well as sharing of user data by a larger set of outlets. Consolidation, that'll be good for the economics, good for keeping users, perhaps not so good for media diversity. So just in my last couple minutes, we did another study in France where we got similar results. Let me talk very briefly about the impact of Facebook on news consumption. And so we have a similar kind of data set, but what we do for this study is that we put the news articles into topics, things like Boston Marathon bombing, 2013 war tornado, and using text mining techniques. And then once we've got them into topics, we're then able to use crowdsourcing to understand what are the characteristics of different topics, as well as what are the characteristics of different articles. And so we use a graph technique to do the topic modeling, aided by Wikipedia. And so just to give like a few of the findings that we have, first of all, you might have thought that now what I'm going to be comparing is what you read when you go directly to a news outlet versus what do you read when you go from Facebook or Twitter. So the blue is what you do with social media. The red is what you do when you go directly. And the green is adjusting for user mix. So it's trying to adjust for the fact that the different users use social media and direct navigation. So if the green and the blue are close together, that basically says that adjusting for user mix, there's not much difference with social media and direct navigation. So we find at the very high level, there actually aren't a lot of differences between the high-level topics, crime, celebrity, business, between social media and direct navigation. But we do find a lot more within-topic variation. For example, we find that on social media, people read stories that are written differently, stories that have an individual perspective, stories that assume background knowledge. We find stories that do in-depth analysis, controversial, opinion, politically controversial, as well as those with a caring, supporting attitude, are all more prevalent on social media. We find as well that there's more specific targeting, like there's more articles shared targeted towards women or families on social media than there is when you go from direct navigation. And we find some differences in positivity and compassion as well between direct navigation and social media. So what we see is that the high-level topics aren't different, but the way the articles are written and how they're told and researched is different. So the final thing that we look at is political bias. And these numbers, actually, we've done a pilot study, and we're trying to do a longer study because these numbers are probably the most sensitive to the sample size. We first of all find that when we look out at topics, some topics tend very conservative and some tend very liberal. So if you're going to read an article about school shootings, it tends to skew very liberal. If you're going to read an article about Benghazi, they tend to skew very conservative. And in fact, one of the big determinants, if you want to try to predict the political bias of an article, the topic can be more important than the news outlet in predicting those things. So the big difference between the Fox and New York Times is that Fox covers Benghazi. If there's ever a story about Benghazi, they're going to cover it. If you ask their digital people, they'll say that's intentional, that's their strategy. That's one of the big things that's different between news outlets. Then what we do, we take advantage of our topic classifications to crowdsource the political bias of articles only for articles that are potentially politically biased. So we throw out the articles about tornadoes and about sports events and only study articles that are potentially politically biased. And then we look at whether people read more biased stuff off of social media. And again, these exact numbers are probably a little bit skewed because of my small sample. But we see that people read less neutral news and more on social media and more neutral news on direct navigation. Then what we do is we look at people who we only look at a subset of people who have read conservative articles in the previous week. And for people that read a conservative article in the previous week, they do very little liberal reading at all, but they do some neutral reading from direct navigation. On contrast, in social media, they're going to skew very heavily conservative. And similarly for liberals, if you've read a liberal article in the last week, we find that you're going to read very little conservative stuff overall, but again, you'll get some neutral content when you go directly to a news homepage, but not so much in terms of social media. And so, in a sense, we can think, however biased you think the New York Times is, however biased you think Fox News is, they're still less biased than your friends and what your friends share with you. And so, there's going to be some very factual reporting coming from major news outlets. And as a result, I think we should be a little bit concerned about the changes in how people get their news as they start going more and more through social media, and they're not curated by kind of editors who at least are trying to be objective some of the time, but rather getting curated by your friends. You may become less well-informed and write your congressman about non-facts and vote for candidates on the basis of misinformation. So broadly, it's a kind of a mixed bag, but whatever is going on, we are seeing some pretty big impacts, and I expect that the media industry is going to go through some pretty major changes. And so we're going to have to think as a society how we fund it, as well as how we protect the informativeness of our population in this new digital age. On the other hand, the good news is that finding stuff for people does seem to make them read. And so if we can find good ways to present accurate information to people in a convenient way, convenient, timely way, maybe, in fact, we can get people to read. So that's it. Thank you very much. I'm so happy to take questions.
Thank you for ending in a political context, because I want to ask the following question. I learned that from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. And I learned that from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Supposedly in the United States there are 3,500 journalists, but 40,000 company public relations officers. And when they wanted to publish an article in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette about all kinds of health challenges from nuclear and coal-fired power plants and so on, they were talking to companies who then immediately told their public relations officer, and then the public relations officer contacted the, let's say, lawyers, and they immediately called the editors of the paper. If you publish this paper, we will sue you. So when you think about this, that we have only 3,500 journalists and 40,000 public relations officers, and how that relates to educate the public about important issues that are connected, what would your recommendation be that you could study in your...
Well, that's a pretty deep question. I mean, and the question really concerns the role of businesses influencing the press. And I have to say that that's among the many things I learned in my time with industry, was that goes on much more than you ever would have thought. And there can be sort of, quid pro quos between, companies trying to give journalists information so they can get a story out, and then the journalists kind of covering it more favorably. At least the companies would hope that would happen, and so sometimes you might see a story and say, oh gosh, it looks like that company planted it, and so on. And I think that does absolutely go on. What you would hope is that at least the companies kind of battle it out, and so if they have opposing interests, both sides get aired, and the competitive process lets the information come out. I think the problem is that maybe it's something like you say, where most of the company's interests lie in one direction, and they're able to invest in research and persuasive information, and maybe they believe what they're saying, and maybe their research supports it, but it's just one perspective, and then there's nobody investing the corresponding offsetting R&D on the other side. And absolutely, I think those are things that we should be very worried about. I think in this country, in the current political environment, it's highly unlikely we're going to do more public funding of journalism. So it's a problem.
Yeah, thank you.
Yep.
I was recently on a debate where the question was, do search engines actually cause more kind of specialization, let's say on conservative versus liberal, or do they allow you to carve more niches? And are we getting kind of more focused with search engines or less focused? And have you thought about the role that search engines could play, basically, or news things like Google News, trying to tell people that, okay, hey, I've been watching your news reading patterns, and you've really been reading only liberal stuff, so let me recommend some things for you here, so you get a less biased view.
Well, I think that's a really interesting question, and I mean, I think the first round so when I first started wanting to study this, actually like 09, 10, it turned out that actually the level of personalization happening in news just across the board was pretty low. So there was really nothing large to study. I mean, it was happening, but it was getting personalization signals were getting swamped by all the other signals. Now I think it's grown pretty substantially. And, the naive algorithms are just going to try to find publication effects and so on. They're going to say, this user likes these kinds of publications, so I'm going to show them more publications like that. So they would create this filter bubble. And Facebook's algorithm, same thing. They're not going to show me stuff I'm not going to click on, right? And sure, they can observe this stuff, and so they're absolutely going to rank on it. There's a deeper question. We actually were talking about this at lunch, whether in some sense, this is where like the social scientists could come in and say, gosh, I know in the short term, like this is the thing that's going to maximize whole page click-through is to show you more of what you like. But maybe in the long term, you're going to value this diverse perspective. Maybe you're forming a perception about neutrality and so on. But it would be very hard to measure that. And so tomorrow I'm going to talk about the difficulty of short-termism in a data-driven world. But if you had a kind of visionary person and you could convince yourself somehow that this was a true factor, maybe some publications could differentiate themselves by making sure to provide a balanced perspective. But my fear is, because it's so hard to measure those long-term effects, even if someone had the idea, in a data-driven world, they would get crushed because you couldn't actually demonstrate. It might take 2 years of watching a user before you really get the benefits of showing that diverse perspective. And so you wouldn't be able to document it, even if it was really there. It's so much easier to measure clicks.
But it could be that the user themselves would be willing to pay for that. Like, I wouldn't want to know if from something I'm like reading overly biased things and forming the wrong perspective. So it wouldn't necessarily be that advertisers would pay more or money come from the other side, but the user might actually be interested in that themselves.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe they could allow you to express that preference, but I think they're probably worried about seeming creepy. Like in some sense, if you tell people that that's an option, they might worry about it. So I think these are very subtle issues. But I would not predict that in the short term you're going to see a lot of that. I think it'll be a longer time before we get good enough at measurement and people get sophisticated enough that companies are comfortable giving you those kinds of choices. Then you can just clear your cookies and yeah.
Slides are very interesting, and I'm wondering if the slides can tell us something about, like, for example, the liberals and the conservatives, they differ in their opinion because they have different preferences, or because they are preconditioned with different information. For example, here both sides are reading neutral news medias, but at the end of the day, they actually send different information to their friends.
Yeah, so I think those are incredibly interesting things, and I should have, by the way, I do want to give the caveat that these numbers are probably a little bit skewed by my small sample, but what I would really want to do, I think, is collaborate with Facebook on an experiment like that, and actually do some randomization at the user level, and also like conditional on what their users were sharing, re-rank it to really understand that. But I think that's the kind of experiment would be a little bit hard for Facebook to do and to publish, just because, again, I think they'd be kind of sensitive to the users, so the users don't want the political bias of their news to be experimented on. And they might be angry if I published or someone else published such a paper. But I think the right data setting to do the experiment, you would need to collaborate with someone who could actually change the rankings in order to tease those things out. This observational data, I don't have any randomization here. I don't even have a natural experiment, so I'm just not able to sort out why these things are happening. I think it's kind of instructive. I mean, I think it's suggestive that they do different things on direct navigation and social media. But I can't say if it's because of what they click on from what their friends shared, or whether it's what their friends shared, or whether it's Facebook's ranking algorithm. There's a whole bunch of things that go into a big soup on Facebook, and without more data, I can't figure that out. Yeah.
This is another Facebook question. In Facebook, there are news articles that are recommended by my actual friends, and they are often followed by a handful of things that Facebook thinks I might also like to look at. Mm-hmm. I casually think that there's a better distribution of bias in the things that Facebook recommends, but I haven't actually tracked it very carefully. Does your data separate that out, and can you say anything about the Facebook recommends versus my actual friends recommend phenomenon?
No, I can't. I mean, it's possible I could tease it from the URLs, but it gets a little bit tricky to figure out exactly where the Facebook referrals come from. Just from the data I have. My observation is similar to yours, but I also think, I guess I haven't seen, like in my news feed, I don't think Facebook's recommending me a lot of pro-Trump stuff, for example. So it's probably figured out that I don't want to read that. But I do think in some sense that can substitute a little bit for the direct navigation and sort of the curation of sort of high quality articles. But ultimately Facebook is going to be looking at what its users like, right? And that's going to be part of it. Yep. Back there.
So there have been studies which have tried to study what happens in the brain of a person who's reading something that is contrary to their opinion, and they've seen some proof of cognitive dissonance. Like, you don't really like reading something that's not conversant with what you think. So given this background and fact, how do you think that we will be able to incentivize people to read a more balanced article? Because, like, as she pointed out, that Facebook actually now does give recommendations based on something that you clicked, which places similar articles for you to click on. And even on Facebook, when I see people debating from opposite sides, usually no one agrees to the other person. It's like people take sides. So you end up finding like-minded people, and then you can even unfollow people who objected against you in arguments.
Well, so I mean, I think that's part of what it's kind of sad that we're losing. So if you think about, as Facebook curates your news for you, you're not going to go to the homepage of the newspaper. And so you're going to be thinking, instead of stories that help create a balanced front page of a newspaper, you're going to be thinking about stories that'll be ranked highly on Facebook and get shared a lot. And so that's kind of an article level optimization rather than a kind of page, a menu, if you like, or a suite of curated content. And I think that sort of suite of curated content that makes a beautiful page was providing a lot of the incentives for the newspapers. Like, they really cared about what that page looked like and what perspectives it showed, and that it covered lots of different things. They really thought about that. And when you just find things article by article, that's lost. And I think then the incentives for quality, reputation, the incentives for balance, all of that goes away, because I have no idea anymore if the New York Times is balanced if I'm only on Facebook, right? Because I'm only seeing the liberal articles on Facebook, and whatever they wrote on the conservative side, I never even see it. So I have no idea if they're balanced or not, right? And so that's, I think, those are some of the things that should concern us when you have these new intermediaries coming on board. So in the short term, by the way, I should really emphasize, my results show that Google News was good in the short term, but the long term, when newspapers respond and outlets change their strategy is much more ambiguous.
Susan, first, thank you very much for a terrific presentation. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on the implications of your research for the business model of newspapers and online media. Is there any hope for online advertising? Is there content-based or paying subscription for content? Is there a future? Do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, so I teach a class on two-sided markets and digital markets to the MBAs, and we have these night journalism fellows who all take my class every year. And so I teach them about the role of the platform and how you bring together the different sides and you can get all these profits. And one of the journalism fellows at the end said, Susan, I think what I learned the following thing from your class. My first example was a farmer's market to try to illustrate that platforms aren't just digital. He said, so basically what you're saying is we used to be the farmer's market and now we're the farmers. And that's basically right. Facebook is the farmer's market. Google is the farmer's market. That's the platform. That's the middleman that gets all the returns. And the news organizations are undifferentiated sellers of apples. And the farmer's market is curating which apples to do, but they're not going to get much surplus. So I think that is a fundamental problem. And the only real answers I can see, there's things around the edges, around different kinds of advertising and subscription models. But ultimately, I think that because the intermediaries are big, it's their size that really allows them all the power. The news media is going to have to get big in some way, too, which will give them lots of economies of scale and data, and they'll have better machine learning, and they'll be faster, and so on. But on the other hand, we'll leave, if it's all owned by Rupert Murdoch, that's going to give us a smaller number of perspectives, right? So the consolidation may go quite a ways, and it also might kill local and certain kinds of things. So it's a little depressing.
Not just a little.
Yes. Okay. Very good.
Thank you so much.